the most important, other than the one that's going to come next. And although they are linked, I think, in some ways. And Mike is going to speak on the programmatic bankruptcy of the left and the urgent need for a thoroughgoing rethink. Okay, so fire away, Mike.
Okay, what I'm actually going to talk about is three general points. The first of which is that mass strikeism leads and very clearly leads to political tailism. Mass strikeism and the fetishism of Soviets leads to political tailism, not only of the social democracy but also of the liberals or the conservatives. The second point is that the communist movement, and the workers' movement in general, needs a maximum program. That is to say, it needs an image of the an imagination of the alternative society, not in detail, not in what Marx called cookshops for the future, but in general terms, and actually slightly more specific terms than was necessary in Marx and Engels' time. The third is that the workers' movement also, that the communist movement also needs a minimum program, and actually needs a minimum program for four distinct reasons. The first of which is to specify the nature of the transfer of political power from the capitalist class to the working class. The second is to clarify the institutional needs of the working class to develop its power, both in after seizing power, but also actually before seizing power. The third is to exercise a control against the trap which leftists have fallen into over and over and over and over again of accepting responsibility in a capitalist government. Most recent examples, Syriza, Rifondazione. I guess there are others as well, but those are, I think, the most recent spectacular examples of something which Marx and Engels characterized as a disastrous policy already in its practice by Louis Blanc in 1848 in France. And finally, the minimum program gives us orientation, an independent orientation of the working class in debates around reforms, and provides a means of us avoiding tailing either tailing the liberals or tailing the conservatives. So I start, and I'm going to hopefully spend less time on this than on the other stuff. The comrades who think of themselves as Trotskyists think of revolutionary strategy in terms of mass strikes, demonstrations, political crises, and this merges into not necessarily an organised insurrectionary general strike, but it may be a mass strike wave, as Rosa Luxemburg puts it in The Mass Strike. And the mass strike leads to throwing up Soviets. Comrade Allen, I'm sorry to address you, as it were, here, but in your fringe meeting on climate change, adding Soviets to the demands on climate change was the thing which made it a program for working class power, the thing which made it, quote, transitional, unquote. Comrades who think that they are Trotskyists, who have this perspective, should go back and read again the chapter called Again on the Soviet and the Party in a Proletarian Revolution in the book Lessons of October. And they should go back, I'm not going to quote in extenso from it, but they should go back and read equally Leon Trotsky's comment on two comments on the Spanish Revolution from 1931, which I am going to quote. The first is on anti-parliamentary cretinism, from the text The Spanish Revolution and the Dangers Threatening It. Parliamentary cretinism is a revolting sickness, but anti-parliamentary cretinism is not much better. We see this most clearly in the fate of the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists. The revolution poses political questions and at the present gives them a parliamentary form. The attention of the working class cannot but be concentrated on the Cortes, and the anarcho-syndicalists will secretly vote for the socialists or perhaps the Republicans. This was in fact quite clearly what happened. The anarcho-syndicalists, refusing all electoral activity as problematic political activity, as electoralism, wound up supporting the People's Front government, which led the Spanish Revolution into the ground. And again, Trotsky in September 1913, writing to Andres Nin, just as in Lessons of October, against the fetishism of Soviets. We succeeded in creating Soviets in Russia, he says, only because the demand for them was raised, together with us, by the Mensheviks of the social revolutionaries. Although, to be sure, they had different aims in mind. We cannot create any Soviets in Spain, precisely because neither the socialists nor the syndicalists want Soviets. This means that the United Front and the organisational unity with the majority of the working class cannot be created under this slogan. So what Trotsky is looking for is, we can see in the May 1931 text on anti-parliamentary cretinism, a clear rejection of the idea that Marxists should, quote, reject electoralism as the anarcho-syndicalists do, and in the letter to Nin, a clear rejection of the fetishism. We've got to put Soviets in, and putting Soviets in will make it into a revolutionary project. I add Paul Blackledge, polemicizing against August Nimtz on electoralism, Marxism and electoral politics, regards Nimtz as falsifying Lenin by overstating Lenin's interest in electoral politics, and the way to get out of this is to read Lenin's notebooks on Clausewitz, as drawing distinction between electoral activity as a tactic and rejection of electoral strategy. I'm sorry, this is desperate stuff. What do we get as a result of this, the outcome of this sort of politics? Okay, this is perhaps not, Richard Seymour is perhaps not exactly representative of the SWP, but he's representative of what sort of education the SWP has produced in a highly educated comrade, and one who has been writing a blog for God knows how long. In June 2019, Richard Seymour, interviewed by Jacobin, is rightly headlined, "Only Jeremy Corbyn can stop Farage." Excuse me. Farage is, frankly, I won't say he's marginalised by Boris Johnson. Then in July 2019, writing for Vice, Boris Johnson is destined to lose. It may at last be Conservatives, curtains for the Conservative Party. It's just the level of inability, the sheer level of disorientation. We can see this. I'm sorry. We meet once a week for various purposes, including decisions about what will be in the paper. And in the course of doing in the meetings, we among other things review the left press. And okay, we can tell solidarity. I keep saying to comrades, we shouldn't treat the Alliance for Workers' Liberties solidarity as part of the left anymore, just as the guy who used to run Aronovich Watch said at some point, Dave Aronovich is no longer counts as part of the left. But we go on reading Solidarity. It's primarily an organ of the witch hunt against the left around Israel, around alleged anti-Semitism, and secondarily strike stuff. Socialist Worker doesn't tell us anything except much about anti-racist, plus also demonstrate. They've got more sense to say strike, because the strike levels is very low, the movement is in a weak situation. What's it for? We know what Socialist Worker is against. It's against racism. What's it for? We know what the Socialist Party is against, but we know very little about what it's for, because again, the Socialist Party theoretically has a programme, but if you look at the press, it's got virtually nothing to do with it. Rural revolution turns into an empty trope. Paul Mason. It's all kicking off everywhere. Radical, general strikeist book. Suddenly we find ex-workers' power. This comrade already, and still close to workers' power at that time. And now we find Paul Mason as a Corbyn supporter, who is actually a critic of Corbyn from the right. He wants to have clearer commitments to the nuclear deterrent. So, this is not new. Eugen von Vollmar in the 1880s was a general strikeist, an advocate of das isolierte sozialistische Staat, that is to say socialism in one country. In his El Dorado speeches in 1891, he became, on the contrary, an advocate of gradualist reformism and coalitions with the German liberals. The problem, essentially, people are forced to make choices which are choices at the level of high politics. I'm going to come back to the question in a bit whether Soviets on its own amounts to the political power of the working class. That's another question. But the consequence, however, actually, general strikeism, demonstratism, what it leads to is we propose the demands which are going to get people out on the street. That is what they already believe. We do not attempt to change people's ideas. People's ideas will change, quote, in struggle. This is, in fact, Bakunin's critique of Marx, going back to the 1860s. Bakunin's critique of Marx going back to the 1840s. Marx is ruining the workers by making theorists out of them. This is it's also actually Lassalle's critique of Marx as well. Lassalle's critique of Liebknecht and Bebel, not Bebel at this stage, but Lassalle's critique of Liebknecht in the debates inside the ADAV, the Allgemeine Deutsche Arbeiterverein, the General German Workers' Association. Lassalle objects to Liebknecht on the basis that he wants to teach the workers theory, and the reality is that the workers will only learn through action. And the way to get action is to have an association with one person at its head in order to create the unified will which is necessary for common action. So what we get, therefore, out of direct actionism, we get political bankruptcy and practical capitulation either to reformism or to indeed to the right. So again, another example of the Socialist Workers' Party. The Socialist Workers' Party joined with the Islamist right in campaigns against sex workers. Now, that's not to say we are for sex work in some sort of liberal libertarian way, but it's not the case that we are for the Islamists' campaign against the sex workers. Or the Rad Fems. Equally, we've got that issue arising in Sheffield of the radical feminists who coalesce with the right wing, outing sex workers as a means of deterring people from participating in sex work. Equally, actually, go back to 1975, the left in general entered into a bloc with the right wing of the Tory party in favour of what would now be called Brexit. Vote no in the referendum. We were accused of being, in Oxford, because we had a tanky Communist Party and a large Trotskyist contingent both in the car factory and elsewhere, and we ran a block under Oxford Trades Council banner which was a separate anti-Europe campaign, and the Oxford Communist Party guys were attempting to be disciplined by King Street for participating in this ultra-left campaign which refused to invite Enoch Powell to speak. And we were also criticised by the IMG head office in, God, it was Pentonville Road then, or was it? Oh, anyhow, it was the IMG head office in London for ultra-leftism, for failing to block with the left Social Democrats who wanted to block with the right wing of the Tory party. So tailism can be tailism of liberalism, which is what's going on with the anti-racism stuff, and actually quite a lot of the gender politics stuff, or it can be tailism of Toryism, conservatism. Okay, so that's step one. Step one is the point that this orientation which attempts to avoid big politics and attempts to avoid electoralism and go for mass actionism leads to political bankruptcy and tailism, both of the reformists and of the right. Step two, we need a program. What does a program mean? It's a platform of what our aims are. It says what we stand for. We can have a party which has disagreements within it because the party is founded on acceptance of a political program. If the party is founded on tactics, or the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, they say we don't have a program because that would be interfere with relations with the masses. What we stand for is the whole record of our tendency back to Workers' Fight, was the original name of their tendency in 1968, and through its character as the Trotskyist tendency in our International Socialists in the 1970s, called Socialist Organiser in the late 1970s, and more recently the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, which actually boils down to we stand on the personal record of Sean Macnair. That's our actual politics. But the consequence of that is actually you can have disagreements, but only if they don't interfere with the control of Sean Macnair, in the same way as in the collapse of the Committee for, split in the Committee for Workers International. This is about you can have disagreements as long as they don't interfere with the control of Peter Taft. Equally, however, suppose your organisation is characterised by, as the IMG, which I was a member of for many years, was tactical intransigence, programmatic flexibility. That is to say, we get, our prime conception is to get where the new forces are radicalising, to be with the new forces who are radicalising, to be with the masses, and in order to be with that masses, we're prepared to move sharply on what the political positions we put forward are. That's still actually the character of socialist resistance. The consequence of that actually is strange as it may seem, that you can't achieve unity, because every disagreement about tactics is going to give rise to a split, because it's the tactics is what you're intransigent about, whether it's the dialectic of unity and outflanking in the years of the Ross tendency in 1972-75, or the project of socialist unification in the socialist challenge period in 1975-78, or the turn to industry in 1979, sending people into factories in 1979-82, or the Ben-Scargill-Livingston attachment connection to the Ben-Scargill-Livingston tendency. This is a totally illusory tendency which we were supposed to be turning to in the mid-1980s, or so on and so forth. Each of these turns generates a new split. So having a program is indispensable to, in fact, having a party as opposed to a series of splinters. Secondly, what sort of a program? It has to be a maximum program and a minimum program. Now, we've argued this, John has argued this numerous times. I'm just going to argue it probably in a slightly different way, but it's arguments for. First off, the maximum program. The question is, what is an inspiring vision of the alternative society? It's not, we do not promise, we never promised you a rose garden. We don't promise instantaneous, that's important. We don't promise instantaneous transition, as the Bakuninists in fact did. We're going to abolish the state, and he stands, well, he's not Bakunin, but somebody else, stands on the Lyon Town Hall steps and says, we have now abolished the state in 1870. The state abolished them. So an image of the future. It's not Sweden. The American socialists tend to have an image of Sweden as representing, it's a bit odd that they should have this, given the, what's the man's name? Girl with the dragon tattoo. Stieg Larsson. The novel's okay, but what they are is novels exaggerated on the basis of the actual dark underside of Sweden, which was a neutral country in 1939-45, but a neutral country with considerably friendly relations with the Third Reich, and which has lurking underneath the all the niceness, and has always had through the post-war period, lurking underneath all the niceness, a large, much larger fascist trends and elements. So not Sweden. It needs to be a cooperative commonwealth. It is fundamentally necessary to begin at least to overcome the blind linkage of our productive activities through the market, through money and market relations. First off, because of the ecological crisis, which both John and Alan have talked about, we cannot deal with the ecological crisis without planning in natura. Planning for, if we say we're going to have carbon, suppose even if you say you're going to have carbon caps and trading, which is bollocks, but in any case, actually, it's already planning. You're saying there is going to be a maximum output of CO2. If we say we want to stop the devastation of the marine ecology by plastic, we actually have to say, sorry, sunshine, Amazon, you are not going to be allowed to go over from cardboard packaging to plastic packaging and all the other stuff. This is planning in natura, and we are going to have movement to planning in natura. Secondly, capitalism naturally leads to radical inequality. Ian Wright's talk earlier this week. The consequence of the fact that capitalism naturally leads to radical inequality is that it depends for its legitimacy on growth. This is a point made by David Harvey. And you can find it in several of his books. But equally, we've got, interestingly, on August the 9th, simultaneously, Financial Times carried Václav Smil telling us that infinite growth is a pipe dream. And Ed Conway in the Times carried, talking up, quote, degrowth, unquote, is not clever or funny. Capitalism is committed, does require. The fact that there's radically unfair distribution undermines the legitimacy of capitalism, the political legitimacy, political authority of capitalism as a system, as a regime. And on the other hand, that requirement, random growth, produces enough trickle down that people are willing to put up, at least in boom periods. People are willing to put up with the radical inequality that it creates. But if we're going to have to limit growth, which we clearly are, again, the ecological crisis, it's not necessarily that we aren't going to have growth, for example, of transportation in what are now third world countries and so on and so forth. The point is that we have to make choices about where growth will be, that we cannot solve the problem of the legitimacy of inequality by virtue of there being random growth at 3% per year to deal with it. Equally, capitalism automatically produces economic cycles. There was an enormous, strong tendency to say, no, it's not true, capitalism doesn't automatically produce economic cycles. And the vast bulk of the output of pro-capitalist economics is to try and prove that capitalism doesn't automatically produce economic cycles. It turns out that there was a suppression, a holding to limited effects of the business cycle in the period 1948 to 1987, roughly, well, 1970s, 1948 to 1970s. That holding of limited effects was due to a combination of financial repression, and financial repression meaning that there was a lot of control over exchange controls. There was exchange controls, controls on the movement of capital, controls on banking, and savings were steered. There were compulsory steers of savings into relatively low return investments, coupled with institutionally accepted inflation in order to devalorize the interests of savers and investors. So there was extensive financial repression, and in addition there was, yet what lies underneath this, massive social democratic intervention, actually mostly to stop booms accelerating out of control rather than to get out of slumps. There was much more cutting off the cap of the boom in order to prevent there being too big a crash, rather than actually trying to get out of the crash by printing more money. I'm trying to remember which Marxist economist it was, made the point in the 1990s that capitalism had been characterized by monetarist actual policy in 1948 under a Keynesian ideological cover, but after the 1980s was characterized by Keynesian actual policy of printing money on a very large scale under a monetarist ideological cover in order to justify redistribution in favor of the capitalist class. Okay, so if we had the cycle and it wasn't accompanied by capitalist class rule, the institutions of capitalist class rule, we could probably live with it on the basis that the guys who would lose out every 6 or 7 years when the crash came along would be savers, investors and pensions. But the problem is that the institutions of capitalist class rule mean that savers, investors and pensioners, particularly investors, large investors, are protected by the capitalist state. And because they're protected by the capitalist state, the losses turn into grounds of interstate contradiction. The immediate example, when the crash of 2008 happened, the British state got assets, got itself out from under, got its own banks out from under the haircut which Iceland imposed on its banks by using anti-terror legislation to seize Icelandic assets in the UK. No ground whatever, it's completely arbitrary. So the consequence is that interstate contradictions accelerate. Secondly, because the down cycle persists, because the losses haven't been forced on to savers and investors, liberalism loses legitimacy, and conservatism and irrationalism of the right gains legitimacy. So that what has to be done at the end of the day to resolve the underlying economic disproportionalities is what? There has to be the underlying disproportionalities will not be resolved until the losses are made to fall on British and American, in this case currently on British and American creditor interests and landlord interests. And if they aren't made to fall on creditor interests by haircut, they will be made to fall on creditor interests by bombs falling on property and infrastructure and massive state defaults, as occurred after both 1918 and 1945. Okay, so in order to overcome, if we're not going to have war, fascism, etc., we have to not merely we can't achieve this we can't overcome the problem by trying to go back to 1945 to 1948 to 1970s, because 1948 to 1970s is the product of 1914 to 45. In order to go back to that, we would have to have a new 1914 to 45, and US obtaining suffering the fate of the British Empire, which is rather more difficult in a nuclear-armed world. So we need a cooperative Commonwealth. We need collective decision-making mechanisms. We need to go beyond the money relationship. A society whose priority is not growth, but whose priority is human development and the facilitation of human development and human creativity. A society which overcomes the permanent specialization of function, permanent occupational specialization. That's, I know this is controversial. Moshe has criticized me on this point before, and the point is simply that it's illusory. The idea of a society of abundance, which is a society of such abundance that whoever the hell that you can have, as Norman Gerace gave the example, suppose I need for my self-realization exclusive possession of Australia. Socialism is not going to give me exclusive possession of Australia. So the corollary of that actually is socialism is not going to be a regime, communism is not going to be a regime in which you can do whatever the hell you like. It's going to be a regime in which we take turns at being in charge. In a sense, actually, this is democracy in the Athenian sense, only without the exclusion of women and slaves. That in such a regime, it's likely that the decision makers will be selected by sortition, casting lots, throwing dice, whatever the hell, random allocation, to a greater extent certainly to a greater extent than would be the case in the transition. Thirdly, a society which repairs the metabolic rift with nature and understands in another way we are inescapably in the Anthropocene, that we can't get out of the Anthropocene and go back to nature is out there as an illimitable resource unless you go for no, that's not true. Even if you go for the deep green policy of massacring 95% of the human species, first off, all the relics of the ruins of the empire will still be with us. what we'd be doing is going back to something more like Anglo-Saxon England, which seems to have lost a massive loss of population, loss of the ability to make pots, because that technical capability got lost, and a whole load of stuff like that. But at the same time sits there, the walls of York and London are still present, and the Saxon shore forts. You're sitting in the ruins of the empire, but also actually the dynamics which gave rise to class society in the first place, and to all the old crap starts up again, as Marx puts it. So this is an image of, this is in a very rough sense, an image of a radical alternative to market society, which breaks with the idea of socialism as a developmental, that socialism will create more growth than capitalism, socialism as a developmental society, breaks with the idea, also the idea of socialism as an economy of unlimited abundance. It's an economy of abundance in the same sense that large game hunter-gatherers, before they hunted the large game to extinction, was an economy of relative abundance. And the point of having a maximum program of this sort actually is not, all I've done is sketched outlines in principle. But that's all that's being done in, for example, Babel's Women and Socialism, which was the text which did duty for the maximum program in the late 19th century workers' movement. Is the outline provides that sort of idea of an outline, and it's not identical to what we've written. What I've said is not identical to what we've written in the maximum program part of our program. But the idea of the maximum program is not, in fact, that that's it. What it is it's an opportunity. It's the opportunity for people to think around, the opportunity for people to imagine, the opportunity for people to write utopian literature, like William Morris's News from Nowhere, or any number of other late 19th century utopians, but not utopians in the sense of Saint-Simon and the forms of barrack socialism imagined in the first part of the 19th century, but imaginations around the idea of what was then thought of as the Marxist conception of the maximum program. My third point then is in relation to the minimum program. And as I say, we need a minimum program for a series of reasons to define the transfer of power, political power from the capitalist class to the working class, to clarify the institutional needs of the working class as a class, both under and after capitalist rule, to exercise control against the temptation to take responsibility for a capitalist government by participating or giving support, and to orient the working class in the political debates about reforms which take place under capitalism. Defining the transfer of political power from the capitalist to the working class. We start again back to Soviets. Yeah, okay, very quick. I'm going to run more quickly because I'm running short of time. Soviets are not the answer to this question, and the problem essentially is spontaneism. Suppose we get a Soviet structure. Imagine, this is, I take it from the Constitution, 1918 Constitution of the RSFSR. Factory committees are elected in every factory by mass meeting. The factory committee sends delegates to City Soviet. The City Soviet sends delegates to a provincial Soviet. The provincial Soviet sends delegates to the Congress of Soviets. The Congress of Soviets elects an executive committee. The executive committee elects a council of people's commissars. Now, none of these institutions except the Council of People's Commissars are standing bodies which meet every day. None of them are standing bodies. The Congress of Soviets meets once a year. The National Executive Committee, the Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets meets, I can't think it's monthly or something like that. So there is accountability potentially. You can sack your delegate. At any instance, you can sack your delegate. And so the attraction of this stuff is, and the attraction of this stuff in the arguments of 1917, 18, 19, was precisely you could sack your delegate in a way in which you can't sack your MP. You can sack your delegate all right, but the problem is once we get up to the rarefied level of the Council of People's Commissars, there's nobody immediately able to sack. You have to wait for the next meeting. And as far as the Executive Committee is concerned, you have to wait for a year for the next meeting of the Congress of Soviets before these guys can be sacked. Second, suppose this is actually weaker accountability than a parliament which sits, at least during parliamentary terms, daily. Secondly, what if you have a hierarchy of Soviets like this and a ban on all parties except one, which is what the Bolsheviks wind up doing, and a ban on factions within the party, which they wind up doing precisely because they've banned all parties except one. They come to the conclusion inevitably the political interests of the petty bourgeoisie will find reflection within the party because we've suppressed them from finding reflection in Menshevik and SR votes in the Soviets. And controls on free speech, which you can't avoid because if you're going to ban factions, you have to ban unauthorized communication between peoples in different branches, which would amount to factions. And control, you have to control the speeches of the locality. What if you add to that, you have a standing army, which the Bolsheviks rightly created a standing army. They had to create a standing army in 1918, otherwise they would have been overthrown by main force, and moreover a standing professional police force, which they called the militia, but in fact these guys were employed full time. In fact, actually, the fact that you've got Soviets and that these were elected by factory committees and that these grew out of the mass struggle makes no difference if you don't have a whole raft of institutional rules under which you control the bureaucracy. You need not just Soviets, not just the spontaneous growth of organs of workers' power, but institutional rules which control the apparatus. Second off, how does the capitalist class rule as a class? I flagged this. Capitalist class is a group of people which holds other people in subordination. In order to possess more than what you can hold on your body or you regularly use from day to day, in order to have possession, you need to have possession through subordinates. Possession, the Roman slave owner possesses through his slave, the feudal landlord possesses through his villeins and his so on. The capitalist possesses through his employees. The capitalist class is a class which holds the other classes in subordination. It holds the other classes in subordination through advertising-funded media, making, let's assume universal suffrage, because before universal suffrage, it's straightforward. The elections are like company elections. You have votes proportional to your property rights. Under universal suffrage, it's necessary to hold the working class in subordination by means other than the electoral system. So we get a whole raft of changes. We lose right to trial by jury is massively reduced. The judiciary increasingly exercises legislative power, blah, 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 blah. But also, advertising-funded media functions as to make universal suffrage into an instrument of deception. You can't fool all the people all of the time, but you, in a periodic election regime, especially in first past the post, and in referenda, you only need to fool 4% of the people 2% of the time. Judicial review and the separation of powers, especially in the United States and in the European Union, where we have an unaccountable final court of appeal which can overthrow legislation. But it's also there in England, although in theory Parliament can overthrow judicial decisions. This is actually a right only available to Conservative governments and not to Labour governments. The principle of one-man management, the single person in the Constitution in the time of Oliver Cromwell, reflected in the existence and predominance of constitutional monarchies in post-war bourgeois states, but also presidential republics, and in some cases also the function of the Prime Minister. So Johnson, for example, is Prime Minister as Bonaparte. He's been elected on the basis that the Tory party. More fundamentally, the most fundamental, the formal subsumption of labour to capital persists underneath the real subsumption of labour to capital. The formal subsumption of labour to capital is the putting out system. The capitalists supply the raw material, the capitalist supplies the raw material to the home workers and buys the goods, finished goods from them. But actually, this is all still there. We generally talk of it as being superseded by the real subsumption of labour to capital, which is the worker's life is controlled by the machine, the factory. But actually it's still there in the factory. And if the Yugoslav regime is a regime of the formal subsumption of cooperatives to finance, market socialism is a regime of the formal subsumption of cooperatives to finance. And going along with that, that relates to the advertising funded media. Capital rules in its capacity as money. Capital as the capitalist class, capital is money, commodity, production, change commodity, money. That whole cycle is capital. But the ruling of capital over society is in its capacity as money, through buying judgments, through buying elections, through buying newspapers and so on and so forth. And most fundamentally, the ability to move. Capital routinely overthrows policies it doesn't like by flight of capital. Look at the Hollande government in France. Utterly trivial reforms proposed, and flight of capital winds it up. So if we think about overthrowing capitalism, we need to win the battle of democracy, we need to turn universal suffrage from an instrument of deception to an instrument of emancipation. We do that through electoral work and also through polemic and the production of workers' particularly the production of workers' newspapers to combat the advertising funded media and so on and so forth. At the same time, in terms of taking power, we need not only to nationalise the bits of industry which capital has already socialised, so infrastructure and power, water supplies and all that sort of stuff, which is obvious. It's the idea that this stuff should be privatised is just obviously irrational and has been for ages. But in fact, we need to be able and willing to take over everything, to go all the way to war communism and planning in natura, merely in order to coerce capital to give way. If we aren't willing to do that, capital will always coerce us through the flight of capital. And it's in that context then, so these basic points about what amounts, we need institutional forms which subordinate the bureaucracy to the working class. That is in fact just as much true under capitalism we need in the trade unions. Not to go round the bureaucracy through rank and fileism, but to find forms which will overthrow the bureaucracy and subordinate the bureaucracy to the working class. We need equally freedom of speech and all the issues of workers' democracy and so on and so forth. If we don't, this is one of the things which particularly the general strikeists have lost sight of, the implications of the workers' programme for the workers' movement. We need to understand that if we take office in a government which isn't committed to making the institutional breaks, to breaking in particular with